Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Endgame class. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and today I'm going to be taking you through some very exciting Rook Endgames. That's right, once again, I am talking about Rook Endgames. In the previous couple lectures, I did a lot of sort of theoretical positions, right? Positions that I could talk about for a long time that we still, to be honest, have not reached the bottom of. There's always more to explore in those positions. You can talk about them for hours and hours and hours. But tonight, I wanted to take those theoretical positions that we have been learning and see what they look like in actual games, putting them to the test, as you might say. So we're going to look at a few really famous games that ended up in some very complex Rook endgames, and we're going to see if we can figure out where each side is making mistakes and why they are in fact mistakes and how they can improve. So let's just jump into it. I'm going to flip over here, and our first game is going to be between Wolfgang, Unzicker, and Erik, Ruben, Lundin. And ignore that text that showed. It's no longer the Skilling Open. That was last class. Now, it's all Rook endgames. So let's get to it. Nobody cares about this. This is not a Rook endgame. What are we talking about? There's a queen on the board. Okay, all right. Rook's on the board. I'm not even going to be talking about this, though, because we see now. Yes, that's right. We are arriving at the glorious, glorious Rook endgame. So, here we are. This may be a position reasonably familiar to you guys. If you were watching last week, you'll know so much about this position with the pieces situated a little bit differently, right? We were looking at this position with the pawn on a6, the rook on a7, and the king on f3. And we said that position is in fact a draw, but not very easily at all. We saw a myriad of ways both sides can go wrong, ways to throw away the win, ways for black to throw away the draw, and it's a very tight line that both sides have to walk. Like, it's not easy at all to play these endgames. So here what we have is a position where white actually has the rook on the side of the pawn. Black's king is in pretty good position on f6, and black's rook is behind the pawn. We know that if white's rook were behind the pawn, that'd be a very different story. White is almost always winning in those cases, unless, if you remember, black can make a passed pawn on the king side for counterplay. So what's going on here? I'd like to get the chat room's thoughts on this, what I'm calling our sort of initial position. I skipped through some stuff a little bit earlier, a few moves in the Rook endgame. This is the first position I really want to talk about. So what's going on? Should white be winning? Should black be drawing easily? What are sort of the ideas for both sides here? How many lines tonight? So last lecture, I like to brag, I spent the entire hour talking about one position. This time, I do have a variety of games that I have prepped. I have no idea, to be honest, how many of them we're going to get to. Depends on how in-depth we actually get here. Be Easy says black is actually winning here. Superior king position, but maybe not. Maybe not. Everybody thinks it should be a draw. Black should give up the f-pawn for the a and try to hold king plus rook plus 2 versus king plus rook plus 3. So I personally am on the side of the people that think it's a draw. However, what Pip and Chuck just said is very optimistic thinking. Very, very optimistic that you think white is going to let you have this pawn for this pawn. This pawn's worth way more. No way is that going to happen. So, of course, we were analyzing a lot of variations with the pawn on a6, the rook on a7, with the king on f3, where white was able to jettison the kingside pawns in favor of advancing the pawn to a7, getting the rook on c7, and then we had all these clever ideas of checking the king and putting the rook behind the pawn to interfere with the other rook, right? We had all these clever ideas. However, there is sort of an alternate plan in this exact position that white has. White doesn't necessarily have to put the rook in front of the pawn. White can put the rook in front of the pawn and go for similar positions by pushing this pawn forward, but white doesn't necessarily have to. This isn't, forced by any stretch of the imagination. So what is the secondary plan for white? What else could white try in this position? There's another very, very important plan that you have to be aware of. Another important plan. So for those of you who haven't watched any of the previous lectures, usually the character of these endgames is that white tries to force black to sacrifice the rook for the pawn, and black tries to advance the kingside pawns far enough and win white's kingside pawns in the process so that black can draw with the pawns against the rook. Force white to sacrifice the rook for the pawns and then draw the game. So how does that make any sense? Well, it turns out to force the rook to sacrifice itself, white needs the king on this side of the board, and by leaving the king side, that is when these pawns sort of become vulnerable. So that is the winning plan and the drawing plan in these positions generally. So chess king says f3, g4, and that is not going to be the right idea here. Those types of pawn trades, putting tension on the king side, is really only going to be beneficial to black. It's a lot better to have one passed pawn against 2 than 0 passed pawns against 1. And we've seen that in previous lectures, where black's drawing idea is to sort of sacrifice one of these kingside pawns as a passed pawn for white's outside passed pawn, and then draw the ensuing rook endgame with 1v0, right? 1v0 tends to be a draw, especially with the black king in front of the pawn. So that's not it. So Jacob Molina has the right idea. Rook f4 and walk the king over. And what does black do? What does black do against this plan, right? It's not so easy to tell. If you pass and just keep an eye on this pawn, you know, it's not as if white isn't making progress here, right? Like, look out. Look out. All of a sudden, wait a second. Whoa, 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 whoa. White's rook got behind the pawn. Like, white's rook is behind the pawn, now it's easily winning. Easily winning. We just push, 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 and it's over. Push, 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 and it's over. It doesn't matter that black is blockading, because now our king is going to be able to invade, right? Part of the problem here for black is you can never pass. For example, if you move the rook, I push up. You just can never pass, so white's gonna break through. For example, you go here, I pass, and eventually I will get into the position and win all your pawns. So what should black do against this plan from white? Rook f4 check. And yeah, Vinny has the right idea. As always, black's play has to come on the king side. You have to find counterplay on the king side, and the only way to stay in the game for black is to go first, I think, with king g7. You don't really want to get your king locked out of the king side in this case. And while white is running the king over, we'll see black find counterplay on the king side by going f6 and g5. And this is enough for a draw here for black. For example, takes, takes, rook over to b4, for example. And I think even h4 is enough to draw here. For example, if you take this guy, I take this guy. And good luck winning this endgame. My rook is behind your pawn, and also, you know, okay, yeah, this endgame's just a draw. Trust me, this endgame's a draw. For example, king c1 isn't going to be good enough. a5, for example, we can just blockado and bring the king over. So I wanted to highlight this idea, though. Rook f4 check. It can sometimes be a very, very, very powerful idea to defend the pawn from the side, provided that you can defend both the pawn and your own kingside pawns at the same time. That's why defending the pawn from the side can be valuable. You get sort of the best of both worlds. You're able to run the king to the queen side and keep all of your kingside pawns. And it's important to realize that with black, you need to do something against this plan. You need to have a response against this plan. In this case, f6, g5 is going to be good enough. And just to show one more line there, let's say f6, g5. Now, also importantly, if white doesn't take this, which might be tempting, now black can, in fact, start going after the pawns on f2, for example. And now if a5, come back here. And this pawn is dead, so perhaps this is better. Sorry. Say rook. Well, we'll say rook c4. Happy middle, right? And here, black is going to push this pawn, and once again, it will be a successful decoy, and black will be able to take white's passed pawn. Okay, so all of that is to say, rook f4, interesting idea, but it doesn't work here, right? Everybody on board with this? So Pippinchuk says, if instead of king g7, king e5, and your point is king e1, f5, but I was never interested. I was never interested in taking your pawn on f7. The power of the rook on f4 isn't that I'm threatening to win black's kingside's pawns, it's that I'm preventing you from winning mine, right? So you can play f5, and you can run your king over here. I don't care. You can do whatever you want. All I care about is getting your rook out from behind my own passed pawn. And then here, maybe somehow actually it's gonna still be difficult for me. Interesting. Maybe now I can actually consider this idea, which I previously said was ridiculous, of going f3 and g4. What's the point? The point is now your king's no longer over here, and this may in fact cause you some problems. Maybe not though. I think this should be a draw. So maybe your idea is actually a good one here. Maybe this is actually a good one. Although I do suspect that I do have some stronger ideas here. Sometimes I can come after this pawn, but I'm not going to make any claims. To my eyes, it looks like this might be good enough, but believe me, it's absolutely impossible to just on the fly give you an evaluation of these positions. There's a lot of specifics to take into account, but it looks like that idea is good enough. But I will say, in general, go for counterplay on the king side. Don't go for some fortress type looking thing, because a lot of times white will have a plan for improvement that you have to look out for. So I like this plan because it sort of keeps in line with our thinking, our general principle. Black draws by achieving counterplay on the king side. All of that is to say though, rook f4 check, not good enough to win the game, which is why probably Wolfgang goes for rook b6 check. Black goes with king f5, and this is the right idea, in my opinion. Why is this the right idea? Well, because in these endgames, like I keep saying, black achieves the draw by finding counterplay on the king side. And that means having an active king. King f5 is absolutely the right way to start here. You could play king g7, but then your king is actually going to be cut off on the 6th rank, and this will introduce some other problems to black, as we'll actually see in, I think, game number 2 or 3. Maybe game number 3. But to start with, king f5 is the right idea. Now, rook a6 was white's point, transferring the rook in front of the pawn. Now we see king e5, a5, king e4, rook a7. And here black plays the move f6. So I would like to get the chat room's opinion on the move pawn to f6. Chat room, what is your opinion of this move? I had a maxim the other day about rook in front of pawn. I don't think I did. The maxim is rooks belong behind passed pawns. In this case, though, obviously white cannot achieve that. So the question was the rook in front of the pawn or the rook to the side of the pawn. And we saw with rook f4 check why the rook on the side of the pawn is not good enough for a win. So what's left? Well, what's left is putting the rook in front of the pawn so you can advance it. Why not rook a8 immediately? Well, we've seen in many cases that having the rook on a7 can be better, thanks to some of those lines that we saw with rook c7. And sometimes it's better to have the rook on a7. Why is that? Well, if the rook ever leaves behind the a pawn, then we are occasionally threatening to capture the pawn on f7. Obviously, in this case, we were not threatening to capture the pawn on f7. For example, king e5. We're not going to take this guy because this endgame is a very easy, very simple draw for black. 2 versus 3, always going to be a draw. But black plays this move f6. So then he just says no, which is fair. I understand that sentiment entirely. Why can't black play king f3? Well, that's probably what black was thinking. You can't go king f3 here because then this move is check. Right? Not so easy. Not so easy after all. Indrajit says, not a good move because black has to get kingside counterplay as fast as possible. So, I'm asking the chat, Pippenchuck, what do you think about this move of pawn to f6? So, it turns out this move is not the greatest, but it's sort of a very, very deep reason why. And it goes back to the lecture I taught on having the pawn on the 7th rank. We'll see that all of these ideas end up being connected in these endgames. So here, with the rook in front of the pawn, f6 turns out to be a move that very much gives white some very serious winning chances. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I know the evaluation of all of these positions, like after each half move. I have it all saved, and I can reference it, but I don't have that just memorized. I think after f6, that black may actually just be losing with good play, but we'll see what happens in the game and see why that might be. So f6, not a good move, but I won't tell you why just yet. You have to wait and see. So what should black have done instead? Well, I think in my opinion, there is a very easy way to deaden the game immediately here with black. So Nicodem actually has the right idea in the chat, so I'm not even gonna ask you guys. f5. This is the move that would have been essentially ending the game for black here. Why is this the move that is, like, you know, removing all winning chances for white? Well, the idea is simple. We go f4. And we get this kingside counterplay that I was talking about. It's really just that easy. This is the only thing going on here. Black is able to force weaknesses on the king side, make a passed pawn, and then draw on the benefits of that passed pawn. And notably, this idea of bringing the pawn to the 7th rank is in fact going to be a little bit too slow here, thanks to king f3. When I think anything here is good enough to win, but perhaps simplest is this move. When, of course, you're never winning this position. Don't really have time for this, because now you lose to checkmate. And black is doing fine. So f5, f4 would have been a great drawing idea. Now, I think honestly, even the move king e5 should be enough to draw. Why is king e5 enough to draw? Well, by not changing the position, black is in this theoretical position that we already know about, that is just going to be theoretically drawn. For example, a6, even king back to f6 can be played. And we've seen this one before, and in fact, we've even seen this one before. And even this, if black gets the king out to or white gets the king out to f3, is a draw. This is exactly the position we spent an hour talking about in the last lecture. King e4 is the best try. g5 ends the game. Of course, it's not quite that simple. So f6 changes the position, and my advice to you is only do this if you are absolutely certain that you have a drawing idea, and that your drawing idea is good enough to hold. So in the game, white goes king to g2. White goes king to g2. So how should black continue now? How should black continue now? Pippenjerk says, if the black king gets cut off from his pawns and loses the f-pawn, white has serious winning chances. So again, it's tough to make serious generalizations on all of those endgames, but in general, black is able to draw even with the king cut off along the e-file. Even with the king on d5 or d4, black is close enough with the king in general to get a draw there. So with the king on the e-file, it's generally not even close. It's just always going to be a draw. g5 is wrong, I know that. So g5 is the right way to think. g5 is absolutely the right way to think. But white to move and come up with an absolute stunner here. g5, you're thinking along the right track. You need kingside counterplay. You need it in your life. But white to play here. So here's what white shouldn't do. White shouldn't take here. and allow black to play something like h4. Although maybe this is coming quickly enough here. Maybe this is coming quickly enough. Let's say, though, black plays a little bit stronger, and now a7 doesn't win due to king g7. I should say the reason why h4 doesn't work here is because, let's say something like this. This even, king f5. The point is now white is always able to leave from in front of the pawn and win with the pawn on the 7th rank. So that's why h4 is wrong. But if black brings the king back to g6, that idea no longer wins. And once again, black is going to make a decoy with the passed h-pawn and get the draw. So that's what white shouldn't do. What should white do? And yeah, the chat room has it now. The stunning move is g4. And this is just ending the game now. Just ending the game. The best try is h takes g4. But now h5, king f5, for example. Now h6, h7, and this rook on a7 comes in handy. The game is just over. The game is just over. This doesn't help. It's the exact same. So g5 doesn't quite work, and it turns out now, after king g2, f6, f5 is also too slow, which is why I think black is just losing after the move f6. So f6 now, we go either rook a8 or I think a6, either one. And what's the point? Well, the point is now f3 check, we go king h3. And here what's going on? Yeah, I think just a7. And you're not in time with this counterplay that was working by a tempo previously. So that leaves one idea for black. This quick kingside counterplay stuff just wasn't working out. So you go king f5. Now, does anyone in chat know the winning plan for white here? Do you remember from the lecture, I think 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, what's the winning plan for white? Winning plan. It's not a very intuitive one. If you guys don't remember, I sincerely doubt you'll be able to come up with it on the fly here. Get the king to c4 and rook c7 to c5 plus minus a4. Okay, so I get what Pippinchuk is saying. He's saying this idea that we looked at in last week's lecture, not 2 weeks ago, where we go a6, which we can start with this, absolutely. And let's say you get everything. Let's say you get everything you ever wanted, okay? I'm not going to fight back. Okay, even if you get this position, black is drawing here. Why is black drawing here? Well, in this case, f6 turns out to be a very useful move. In this case, you make f6 out to be a useful move rather than a mistake. Why is that? Well, let's look at the ensuing variations. So king g4, for example, and let's say king b3. Yeah, we'll start with king b3. Rook a1, we'll say. So, sorry, I'm going the wrong. King b3 doesn't make sense here. Why doesn't king b3 make sense here? Because our rook's not on c7 yet. So white should go for this plan of putting the king in front of the pawn. And here, black is just going to continue with, I guess, rook takes f2 is the most accurate. Now, for example, rook c7. I'm going for this plan. Take a7, rook a2. And now, after king b7, black has an improvement. So in previous variations with the pawn on f7, black was always having to play king takes h4. And by the way, it's possible I didn't do the most accurate sequence just then, but the point still stands. Black has an improvement over king takes h4. Black's play actually comes a lot faster with the move g5 here. And that's why pawn to f6 is a useful move against this plan. So if the pawn's on f6, this plan shouldn't ever really work. Black should always be in time, thanks to this pawn being on f6, to support this move g5 and sort of quicken the play. Now black is making a passed pawn and getting to h1 much faster than before. So we need a new plan. In which, by the way, in the game Rook A3 was played here, and now obviously King F3 is not as easy to achieve. So Rook A8, Rook A2, and now King F3, but now Rook A3 check, King E2, King E4. So white to move here. White to move here and find the winning plan. Does anybody see it? Does anybody see it? I'll be absolutely astounded if you guys can tell me the winning plan without having seen it. So F3. F3 is the start. I'll give F3 to you. F3 check. You cannot take this pawn because I will check you and take your rook. So the king backs up. But what's the point? What's the point, everybody? What's the point? The king backs up. What's the big deal here? What is the big deal? How do you win the game? Give mate. Pipinchuk is close. But before we give mate, there's something else we have to do. So once again, the idea of G4 is just never going to be correct here. It's never going to be correct. Take, take, take. The only time it was correct was when we made an unstoppable passed pawn. That's the exception to the rule here. Now if you try something like A7, it's true that I can't take this pawn, but it doesn't really matter. I don't know what the simplest is. Maybe F5 is simple enough. No, F5 allows H5. So I'll go King H3, exclam. The point now is if H5, I will take it. Not King takes H4, allowing Rook H8, by the way. And now I'll run this pawn up the board, and we will agree to a draw. So it's not G4, and King D2 isn't it either. Why isn't King D2 it? Well, now Black will simply take this guy. This move just is responded to by this with a similar endgame, and you just aren't really in time for any of this. I think I can even take this guy, with the point being that I can just check you until you let me onto the A file. Yeah, so that's not the plan either. Can't run the king, and you can't play G4. So that leaves one idea. You guys are right. That leaves A7. And now comes the magic question, guys. How do we win? Right? We put the pawn on A7, and this does a lot for us. This does a lot. This makes sure that this king on F5 is not able to move. You can't move this king anymore. That king is frozen. You step out this way, I'm checking you. These moves, they're all illegal. So this king is frozen. What does that mean? Well, that means this rook is doomed to wander the A file forever. But as we've seen before, if you, for example, wander your king all the way up to this side of the board, you're going to get checked from behind and you have no shelter. You have just no shelter. So, how do you win the game after A7? How do you win the game? King to H3? King to H3 isn't really going to make a difference either. Why not? Well, I'll tell you. Play a move. Right? You're not going to play G4 because I'm going to take it. And there's actually no real way to triangulate here, right? I just don't step to A3 until you step to H3. And so this too is just a draw. Get the king to F7, Rook C8, Rook C5 check. That would be great. That would be great. King F7, Rook C8, but then Rook takes A7 is actually going to be check. But Chess King is close. Chess King is close. Close to the right idea there, Chess King. Master Zeus asks, is that water or Russian water? And unfortunately, this is just regular water here today. King F7 doesn't work, guys. Rook takes A7, comes with check. You have no time to move the rook out from in front of the pawn. And Jack Jefferson is here with the right idea. The point is not King H3. The point is not King F7. The point is you put the king all the way on H6. Perhaps the furthest square away on the board. That's as far away as you can get. That's a long journey. But it's the journey that white's going to make. and it turns out it's a journey that's good enough to win the game. Why is it good enough to win the game? Well, let's see how Unzicker continues here. King d4. Black tries to stop the king from entering, but of course, black has no passing moves, so you have to let the king in. Rook a1 now, so if king b6, once again we get checked forever. King d6, though, is Unzicker's choice. Now rook a3 is an empty threat. Black can never take this, or else I will queen. King e7, rook a6, king f7, rook a3, king g7, rook a1, and now king h6, rook a6. And what's the point? Why is our king on h6? Why did we put our king here? Did he see that from the beginning? Maybe. Maybe. It's possible. It's possible. Pippinchuk says rook g8. Villy says g4. And Chess King says rook b8. So 3 competing ideas here. Once again, g4. Not going to be the idea. We take, and take. Not good enough. Not good enough to win the game. Taking this just isn't going to do it. We go f5 check. King goes somewhere. And I think we can even take this. Now with your king behind my pawn like this, it's sort of almost as far away as if it was on b7. In fact, I think these 2 squares are equidistant from this pawn. Well, more specifically, they're equidistant from the e4 square, believe it or not. 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. It may not look like it, but chess geometry is different than normal geometry. There's no Euclidean geometry here, okay? This square and this square, same distance from this guy. So that's always going to be a draw. Not g4. Not g4. And rook g8. Also not going to be the idea. Once again, black is able to draw the game, I believe. This time not so easily. But this position should also be a draw? Maybe not. Maybe rook g8 is technically good enough to win. Yeah, apparently g4 here is technically winning, but white need not trouble himself with looking at this because rook b8 is simply much better. And the point now is you don't take g6 with the rook, but you do take it with the king. And now h5 falls, and white is just going to be 2 pawns up. Rook a8 played in the game is a good try, but now king takes g5. Rook g8, if you check me, then I would run behind my pawns. g4, check here, and you can almost take my h-pawn, but when you do, I am sadly for you at least, going to be taking your f-pawn. And 2 pawns up is always going to be winning for white. So that's the crazy idea. That's the crazy idea. And that's what I mean when I say all these Rook endgames are connected to each other. In this game, Unzicker wins because he knows this idea of having the pawn on the 7th rank is winning against this setup by black. And this is just one example of how that setup can actually sort of come to be, right? It's not just some theoretical setup that's never going to actually happen. It's a very logical plan for black. To play f6, think about coming with g5 a little bit later on, and then the refutation is useful to know. You put the pawn on a7, you bring the king down and around the world over to h6, and then you go on and win the game. And that is our first example of the night. So in this case, I think it was actually pretty well played by Unzicker. Obviously, black sort of lost his way here with the move f6. Now, is black just lost after f6? I think so, but like again, I don't fully remember. Maybe there's some idea that I'm missing. But in general, f6, I am very confident in calling it a mistake because black should never lose this game, and f6 introduces a whole host of losing ideas that weren't there before. Very nice lesson. We're not done yet. We only spent 40 minutes on one position tonight. So now I want to go over another game, this time between Grandmaster Vlad Akopian, not to be confused with Akopian, famous St. Louis Grandmaster, but Akopian. Once again, nobody cares about this part of the chess game. We are interested in the Rook endgame. So here, black plays Rook d2, coming after the b pawn. White's really also this guy, white's only winning try is to come take this a-pawn, which he does, and we arrive at this position. And once again, we see this setup on the king side. And I mentioned this when I was talking about the theoretical position. Why do we look at the position with the pawns in this structure? Well, this is just sort of the best structure for both sides. There are some nuances to know in the f4, f5 structure as well, but in general, that's a worse idea for black to go for, and it's a worse idea for white to go for as well in many cases. So this is sort of our normal structure, and we'll see that grandmasters sort of understand this and are consistently just building this structure in these Rook endgames. So with that brief aside, I'm going to fast forward a few moves here because the players sort of were just passing back and forth for a while. Okay. So rook a3 check. Sorry, this is the moment that I want to talk about. So here, white has done something really, really interesting. Number one, white left the pawn on a3, and in doing so, allowed his king to escape out in front of the pawns, which is, of course, much more favorable than having the king stuck on f1, for example. King in front of the pawns is always good. Number two, white has left this rook on a6, and this is a great, great, great winning idea for white. Now, not saying it wins, but I'm saying it's a great try to improve your position to the point where it could become winning. How so? Well, it's stopping the black king from coming out to f6. And this is, of course, a very, very relevant idea. All of the drawing ideas that we looked at involve this black king coming to f6 and playing the move g5. And that is, of course, the very, very important drawing idea to look out for. Now, what else has white done? Well, I guess that's about it. Got the king in front of the pawns and left the rook on a6. Now, a4. So I'm going to ask you guys in the chat room here, with the black pieces, how would you go about trying to draw this position? How would you try to draw here? So Pip and Chuck, again, f3 g4 is almost never right because having two passed pawns versus one is much worse than having one passed pawn versus 0. So for the last time, if you go f5, g4, I'm just passing. Let's say I do this. It's a better pass. g4, I'm going to take it and play f5. And now one passed pawn versus 2 is a draw. This is just always a draw. Making a passed pawn on the king side is the antithesis of what white should be doing. Black is trying to make a passed pawn on the king side. White is trying to use this pawn to win the game by forcing black to sacrifice the rook for it. So stop going for f3 g4. It's not good. It's good for black. You are playing the defensive plan for black in that case. But how do you try to draw with black here? How do you try to draw? A4 played in the game, by the way. So black to move here. Chess King, you'll have to fix your notation there. I'm actually not entirely certain what you mean. So Jacob Molina says f6 g5. And yes, rather paradoxically, f6 being wrong in the previous game is absolutely correct here. And it's important to understand why. Why is f6 correct? Well, in the previous position, black was not in time to play the move g5. Why not? Because white's pieces were too far advanced, right? Let's jump back. I don't want to do too much of this, but we will jump back for the moment. f6 played in the game. And goodness gracious, Lichess did the thing where it mixed up all the variations. This is the main line. Okay, f6 played in the game. White goes king g2. And now, of course, g5 loses to takes, and a6, when you just simply aren't in time because white is able to put this pawn on a7 and win the game. Now, let's contrast this with this position. Let's say white does the exact same thing. Goes a5, we go g5, takes, even rook a7, let's say rook a8 though, h4, takes, or king f3 if you prefer. I think this is worse though. So takes, king f3, now h3, a6, And sorry, black is winning after a6, so you have to go king g3. H2 takes and takes, and black is easily drawing in this rook endgame, which hopefully you guys all know. Hopefully you guys are familiar with this one. Perhaps rook f5 is the simplest here. Everybody loves Vancouver. Who doesn't love Vancouver, right? All right. Okay. So f6 g5, great drawing idea. And I'm not going to pretend there aren't any more like subtleties and nuances to know, but f6 g5 in general is the right idea. So Georgiev's play in the game is perhaps just entirely wrong here. He goes rook a3 check, which is sort of reasonable. Sort of reasonable. You go check, and I think the idea was probably to go rook a2 and come capture this pawn on f2. But then Georgiev sort of switches ideas again and is like, oh wait, no. I'm supposed to go f6 g5. And unfortunately for black, this is going to be different than the first time we looked at f6 g5. Why is it going to be different? Well, this was a really crucial tempo that you just gave up. And also, by the way, you're no longer attacking my f2 pawn. So two things that are really, really important, not letting the king further into the position and pressuring the kingside pawns, and black abandoned both of those ideas with the move rook a3 check. So while it might be tempting to play something like rook a3, rook a2, just to try to like force matters, force white to defend this pawn or commit to giving it up, it's important to understand that that is just entirely wrong in this position. Once again, better is simply passing. Even just passing the move back to white is better. Why is it better? Because now at least you're not giving up pressure on this pawn. At least you're not giving up the pressure on the f2 pawn. And white will continue with something like a5, and the game will go on from here. But best idea by a far stretch is f6 g5 immediately. Just breaking out on the king side, finding counterplay over there, always going to be the correct way to go about life. So a4, rook a3 check, king d4 played in the game, and now f6. So now let's flip the script a little bit. We're no longer trying to draw the game with black. We are trying to win the game with white. Would rook f3 have worked instead? So yeah, rook f3 is a much better idea here. Why is rook f3 a better idea? Because now f6 is simply too slow. You have given white too much with rook a3. So if you do play rook a3 check, you gotta follow up. You gotta commit with something like rook f3 or rook a2. I think rook f3 makes a bit more sense so that this pawn can't move. And this is one of those positions where I'm not going to be able to tell you the evaluation on the fly here. I think if I'm remembering correctly, this one is also winning for white, but it's like very, very difficult. You have to do things very precisely. But I might be wrong in that this one might be a draw. I'm not going to pretend that I actually remember here. But yeah, rook f3 would have been a much better defensive idea after rook a3 check. That being said, it's still the wrong defensive idea when compared with the easy draw after f6 g5, but it would be better than sort of mixing these ideas with rook a3 f6. So that's a good comment there. All right, the game continues now. How do we win with white? Pip and Chuck, you gotta break your intuition here. White is not going after the king side. White's never going after the king side. So this move rook f7 is just nonsensical. First of all, this is with check. Second of all, we're not trying to win the king side pawns for the queen side pawn. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to win with the queen side pawn. So a5, yeah, a5 is a perfectly reasonable move, but inserting rook a7 first is better. Why is it better? Because if you do things in the other way, then maybe black's king is marginally better on g6 rather than on h6. So rook a7 check is the good way to start. Now king h6 and a5, g5. Okay, so with white now, black has given you a lot, right? Black has done a lot for your position. What do I mean by that? Well, he's advanced your king. He's no longer pressuring your f-pawn. And that's a lot. Okay, so he's still going for this idea of g5, though. So what is going to be the winning try for white here? What's the winning try? Details in endgames very important. I agree. But there are some guiding principles that hopefully you're starting to pick up on. Black going for kingside play, pressuring the kingside pawns. White trying to advance, trying to get the king as far into the game as possible and prevent black from making passed pawns. So, okay, I think starting with a6 is fine, but I like king c5 from the principled perspective. Why do I like king c5 from the principled perspective? Because we're just trying to get the king in front of the pawn here. You can start with a6 though, so I'm not going to call a6 wrong at all. And honestly, maybe it's even just as principled. But what's the point of these moves? Well, the point of both moves is the same. It's to stop black from doing something very, very specific. So let's jump back one more time. Sorry if this is confusing. We'll jump back here to the proper plan of f6. So in this case, if white had played the move king d4 instead of h takes g5, what happens? Well, black has a very, very easy way to draw here. And that way is to take on h4. White takes on h4, and then black succeeds in creating the passed pawn. Black takes on h4, easy draw. This h pawn is worth this a pawn, and that'll be the match. Okay? Okay. If anybody disagrees with me, watch last week's lecture. We went over positions almost exactly like this. So, in our game position, either king c5 or a6 should be played, and the reason for that is that it prevents this idea of taking our h pawn. Now, this is the game continuation. Rook a4 was played by black, but this is just a little bit of a lazy move because rook a4 is just refuted by a6. Black now can no longer capture on the h4 square. There just simply isn't time. For example, rook d7 or c7. I think rook c7 is probably accurate enough. Sorry, hold on. This is one of those lines where I was just like, oh, obviously this is losing. I remember how this is losing. I don't need to put it in the study. But then here we are. Here we are. Okay, rook d7, I'm going to claim is the correct idea here. And the point now is that if rook a4, you can go king b5 and rook d4. That's the point. And it's just far too slow for black now. You can't get back behind the pawn in time to draw the game. That is the point of this idea. Also, by the way, rook d4, very cleverly stopping h4. And this is going to be too slow in this case. White is just close enough here to win the game. Okay. King b5, for example, h4. King c4, for example, h3. This, I think, would be a mistake now, but rook d1. And, sorry, should go here. And now if you do this, I take this guy. If you go here, I bring my king in and win the game. All right, everybody agrees. Everybody agrees. So rook a4, a6, and rook takes h4 loses to rook d7 with this same idea. And I think, honestly, other things also win here. For example, rook a8 and a7, king g7, king b6. And this is also just in time to win the game because this rook simply is not far enough away. If you check me, I go here and go rook b8. And now I win. So that's the simple line. That's the simple line. Rook a8, sorry. So all of that is to say, black is a move too slow here with rook a4. You don't have time to take this guy and come back to the a file. White is able to win the game in those cases. So after a6, black is sort of just busted, and rook a4 is a wasted move. Rook a2 played in the game. Now simply rook a8 is the idea for white. King g6, king b6, rook b2 check, king a7, rook takes f2. By the way, why does black insert rook b2 check? Because if you don't, then a7 here is going to be strong with this idea. So that's why rook b2 to stop a7. And then rook takes f2. Rook b8 now is the right idea for white. Once again, aiming to go rook b5, king b6, and rook a5. This is the idea to promote the pawn or force the rook, sacrifice the fastest. You want to interfere with the rook on the a file. Rook f4 is white's idea, black's idea, rook b5, rook h4. But now, unfortunately, black is just a hair too slow. This move obviously loses to rook a5, but rook e4 is a better try in the game, bringing the rook to the back rank. But now rook a5, notably, rook a5, not king b7. Why not king b7? because we would much rather take back with our rook on a8 than our king, because we need our king close to the king side in order to win the game. So rook a5 here, and now h4, but white is winning with a8 queen. If you go rook a8, by the way, I'll just go here, and this has not helped you at all. Even rook takes. Yeah, even rook takes. And now the king will come back. So in the game, h4, queens, takes. And then we see king g5, and the mad dash back to the king side starts. h3, the rook comes behind the pawn. And now we bring the king. Check. And who recognizes this position? You probably should, because this has been seen in last week's lecture. King f2 is the winning move here. If you queen, I check you, take the queen, and if you knight, you are still doomed to failure. To rook g2 check, takes, and here black ended up resigning. So we made it through 2 games here. Does anybody have questions about these 2 games? I did go a little bit more quickly through the end of that last game, but any questions? There was a lot that we talked about here today, and a lot that we put into practice that we talked about in the past couple weeks. But these show 2 examples where black was unable to put up the correct defense, and white was able to find a way to break through. These were 2 pretty good games by white. What happens when the black king goes to h1? So in this last example here, if king h1, white wins by pseudo stalemate. This pawn has to move, and this one is good enough. Are we doing another quick position? No. No time for that stuff. Just a couple minutes of question and answer. Why not f4, a move to stop black by making a passer? How do we remember all this stuff? So you don't necessarily have to remember the specifics. The point of tonight's lecture was to look at this more from a principled approach in actual games. So let's recap some of those principles, right? Black needs to find counterplay on the king side of the board. How do you do that? Well, f6 g5, as we saw in this game, would have been the correct way to do that. You want to make a passed pawn. You want to divert your opponent away from the queen side pawn in order to achieve that draw. You want to make a passed pawn at all costs. f6 g5 generally is a very reasonable plan to do that. What you don't want to do is drive the king up the board, as we saw. Oh, went back a little bit too far there. As we saw with this awful move, rook a3 check. Aside from that, it's good, of course, to keep the black king inactive and activate your own king. That's stuff that we learned from this game. Now, in game number 1 here, it was really crucially important to understand why rook f4 check wouldn't win. In general, if you can defend your pawn from the side and defend your king side pawns at the same time, that's sort of your ideal case. So rook f4 check would have been white's ideal case here, but again, this plan of f6 g5 is good enough to draw, so white goes for this instead. And then from here, in these positions, f6 is not always correct. Why isn't f6 correct? Well, first of all, the plan of g5 was too slow because a6 would have been winning. Do you have to remember that? No, but you do have to calculate that, which is unfortunate. And aside from that, since f6 g5 is too slow, f6 is a terrible blunder, because now bringing this pawn to the a7 square is simply going to be winning for white, as we saw in the game, where white brings the king all the way over to h6. Right? Like so. Okay. So, final questions. What about 4 versus 4 and an extra pawn on the queen side? I don't know. Future lecture. Are there major differences with 4 pawns each on the king side? I am not confident enough to give you a straight answer to that right now. Apologies. Where do I study these positions in games? So a lot of this stuff that I've been doing the past few weeks is sort of sourced from Dvoretsky. The positions are mostly shown in Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, and as always, I would recommend you go to Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual for a comprehensive analysis of all of these positions. my goal is to make that at least a little bit more digestible to you guys, because in my opinion, that book is a very hard read. Very, very hard read. Okay, I am going to call it here then. If you guys are still interested in some more chess, the show is moving to Twitch next up, so please join us on our St. Louis Chess Club Twitch channel, where I will be doing Analyze Your Games. So send in your viewer games and I'll analyze them. Aside from that, that is going to do it for us here tonight. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.